Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around, turn me around, turn me around. Ain't gonna let nobody turn me around. I gotta keep on walking, keep on talking, marching to the freedom land. We named a baby Justice, just to see history repeat itself and watch herself destruct before our eyes. Seeing is believing, and this world has looked on as Black and brown and Muslim and queer babies have been targeted for centuries, standing on the legacy of white supremacy. This world is all about consumption, swallowing hollowed out bones, incarcerating the dead's children, telling the world that they sold their humanity for a peace that gave them refuge inside a ticking time bomb. How could a thing like freedom survive here? Off gunpowder and life sentences, off overly surveilled neighborhoods and zombie boys who act how they act simply because they Black and they know somebody is watching. Wailing and waiting because a plantation, a street corner in the ghetto, San Quentin is really a reconstruction of the same old thing. Out of 4 older siblings of mine, 2 will spend half of their lifetime behind bars. So tell me, what kind of justice do I give my mother? What kind of behavioral shift can occur in a place that cavity searches, places numbers over names, strips the fluidity of genders, violates every body in thought and action, calls a body dead before the last breath can exit? Let us stop lying. Prisons are plantations, not a space for rehabilitation. This land thrives on capitalism, and if you make no money, you cannot afford the cost of your own skin. Neither can you afford the life of children you birth. This is a world of vigilance. But police are not protecting Black and brown bodies, because if they were, barbecue Beckys would not exist. We would not live in a world where calling the cops is standard anytime a Black person is existing right in front of you. With all of their audacity, all of their lungs and life, we would have never known Oscar as a martyr, or Nia Wilson as one of our youngest ancestors, nor Nipsey Hussle as another slain community leader. We have to wake up and feel the residue of historical traumas still kissing the feet of this country, still singing Negro spirituals as we bury our babies with one hand, and fight off every disgraceful person representing MAGA on a red hat like it is not a direct assault on the bodies of people of color, like it is not a reminder of Klansmen, a history of white men operating on the bodies of Black slaves for the world to call them scientists and gynecologists, while simultaneously erasing us Black women from any and all history books, wrapping our bones around your necks, priceless artifacts, but never humans. Where has the harmony gone to? What altered the air that our children consume? So often they are walking home breathless, crying, using their tears to write obituaries, so forgive us for knowing nothing of justice. The English language has a way of swallowing whole cultures to maintain the status quo, and I know no freedom to be in this world, for she is still a seed, awaiting her season to blossom. Thank you.
And thank you, Cece. And before Cece leaves, let me just share with you that Cece Gordon is the Media, Arts and Culture Program Manager at RISE in Richmond, where she creates spaces where youth are comfortable so they can challenge themselves and their peers in their art while building community. She is currently the Poet Laureate of Richmond and was part of the Root Slam team that placed 5th in the nation. Thank you, Cece. And with that, before we start our conversation today, Seth Davis is going to open us with a land acknowledgement.
Morning, everyone. I'd like to invite you to join me in the following land acknowledgement. We gather today on the territory of the Ohlone people who have stewarded this land that we're on, for generations. We recognize that this ancestral and unceded land continues to be of great importance to the Ohlone people. By offering this land acknowledgement, I affirm Indigenous sovereignty and will work to hold the areas where I live more accountable to the needs of Indigenous peoples. If you'll permit me a moment, I want to invite us to think about how a land acknowledgement like this one is not just a performance. It is, of course, an acknowledgement. It is also an affirmation of Indigenous sovereignty. And third, it is a call to action. Thank you.
So, good morning. Great to see you. What a wonderful room of people. So I'm just going to make a couple of remarks. I'm Victoria Robinson. I direct the AC Center at UC Berkeley, and it's a real pleasure to be able to be with friends and colleagues here today doing such important work. So I'm just going to open up with those remarks, introduce our fantastic panelists, and then we're going to ask something of you, and then we'll have a conversation through our wonderful panel. So, what is justice? The title of our panel today. And actually, just as that went to press, I was thinking we should have changed the title. It should have been, what is justice, comma, really, question mark. And I think that comma, really, question mark, is really where we're going to hold a lot of our work today. But to acknowledge that the thinking for this panel has been inspired by so many, and 4 of the individuals who inspire me particularly, and their collective work are the panelists for our discussion today. And so I really want to thank them for being with us. It's a really busy time of year for everyone. The thinking behind this panel is also, of course, directly inspired by the long arc of work and struggle that we all sit within, and also the long trajectory of rich imagination and dreams, or to borrow from UCLA Professor of History Robin D.G. Kelly, freedom dreams, that were nourished by everyday acts and long-sustained social movements. From Gaza to Cape Town to Detroit, Chiapas, they have powerfully shown us the limits of structures and institutions of justice, and also the possibilities and conditions which might produce safer, healthier, thriving communities for all. Our conversation today will hopefully both draw us into the very meanings of justice, which frame our panelists' work, but also test the limits of those terms of justice. Ultimately, we're here to learn from each other in order to build a trajectory out of the room to those families and communities that we do our work with and for. And with that, here's a brief introduction to our Fantastic Four. Is that the name of a film? I think it is, isn't it? Okay, I didn't come up with that. Okay, so this is just a brief bio because there's so much more. There's a depth and breadth of work that's hard to capture, and for the sake of time, this is just a little bit. So Clare Bayard. Clare has organized for over 20 years in grassroots multiracial movements for collective liberation, also co-founded the Catalyst Project, a movement-building center supporting white anti-racist organizing. Clare's body of work is broad and deep in many movement sectors, which we cannot cover adequately. But it's clear to say that demilitarization and connecting struggles against US empire at home and abroad are at the heart of Clare's political work. And Rachel Herzing, here to my left. Rachel is my mentor. So there's a lot of favoritism and nepotism on this panel. Rachel Herzing is the co-director of the Center for Political Education, a resource for political organizations on the left, progressive social movements, the working class, and people of color. Rachel has been an organizer, activist, and advocate fighting the violence of policing and imprisonment for over 20 years. She is also the co-founder of Critical Resistance, the national grassroots organization dedicated to abolishing the prison industrial complex. And to Raha Jorjani. Raha is the founder and director of the Immigration Representation Unit of the Alameda County Public Defender's Office, the first unit of its kind on the West Coast. In 2015, she taught Berkeley Law's first crimmigration course, and we all live in the wonderful shadows of that work. Thank you, Raha. Since 2005, Raha has provided representation to hundreds of immigrants, most of them detained before the Immigration Court, BIA, district courts, US Court of Appeals, and state courts. And to Seth Davis. As a professor of law, Seth Davis's scholarship focuses on the hard choices that we don't acknowledge or hope to avoid when we create rights of action and allocate lawmaking authority. Seth focuses on the hard choices as they arise in federal litigation, federal administrative law, and federal Indian law on the one side and property and tort law on the other. Thank you, Seth, for being with us. You've only been at Berkeley a minute, and we grabbed you straight away, so thank you very much. And so to everybody in the room, we have a small exercise for you, which is going to take about 3 minutes, and we'd like you to turn to the person at your elbow and just chew on the question, what is justice for you? And where is it that you've seen justice come up? So what is justice for you, and where have you seen justice come up? So those of you who are on the receiving end of some discussion, let's share. What was your conversation? What were you hearing from the person who was sharing with you? What is justice? Where have you seen it happening? So that's justice for you, to treat others as you would like to be treated yourself. Thank you.
We were talking about or reminded of the Colonial West Coast justice is what love looks like in public.
That's a good one, hey? Yeah, thank you. I hope somebody's writing all these down, because I need them later. Other ideas, thoughts of justice, what justice is to you? Yeah.
We talked a little bit about both the criminal system, but also thinking about justice as the removal of barriers. The writing of that historic trauma, historical trauma, and really thinking of it not as a victim and perpetrator in the sense we think of the criminal system, but really thinking about it as how do we make this more just?
Right.
It would be to remove
Right. So removing barriers and creating the presence of something. So very action-orientated. Thank you. Others on justice. Yeah.
I think it's important to acknowledge that justice is defined within a value system, and there are many different kinds of values.
Right.
So correctly that you can unpack. I mean, we both looked at each other and said, but there's so many value systems in which justice is defined and
Yeah.
needs to be unpacked in the illustration where we talk about the diversity of those value systems.
Yeah. Great. Thank you. So valued-centered understandings of what justice is, the multifaceted, multi-natured, and of course our panelists are going to define all of them for you. A last thought.
I experience justice when it's healing. And so Bryan Stevenson, when something is actually righted, that's
Right.
wrong, it isn't just the individual, it's the community around, it's the whole story
Right.
of who we are. So there's this ripple effect of healing that happens when
Right.
something that was really wrong was noticed and addressed and is now in the consciousness. So we get to have that now.
So in the presence of trauma, healing, the preface that healing is necessary for justice. For those of you who, everybody in this room must know Bryan Stevenson's Just Mercy from the Equal Justice Initiative. We'll generate some reading lists coming out of this room, I think. Let's turn to the second question briefly, which is where have we seen justice happening? Where have you seen justice happening? Yeah.
I think in our discussion, we struggled with finding an example of where justice has happened.
Right.
And that in and of itself is very telling about where we are as society.
Right. Yeah. We think we'll know it when we see it, right? But we're not sure what we're seeing. Yeah.
Hi, so we talked about Rwanda because for the two of us, that was the closest thing we've seen to justice, where they are taking steps to, first of all, they acknowledge the genocide of 100,000 people. They have committed to bringing justice those who feel part of it. They really they set up systems that have resulted in perpetrators and victims and had. So while we don't know if it's purpose or if it's felt as justice for all lost loved ones, it's the closest thing on earth that we can come up with as a
Great, thank you. So we may have those reference points, right? And I think you're naming reconciliation, redemption, truth and reconciliation, and we think institutionally and historically about some of those. So we're going to have time again to come back to these questions and how you reflect on what the panel share with you. But we're going to dive now in and we've asked the panelists to think with you for 10 minutes each about what the mechanisms of justice look like for them. And so first, we're going to turn to Clare.
Okay. And can you hear me okay? Yeah? Awesome. Hi, I'm Clare. I'm super honored to be in this conversation with all of you. And I have my own questions about mechanisms of justice, but I do want to tell you some pieces of a story from my work is at the intersections of white supremacy and racism and war, specifically, and empire, ending all of these. And I wanted to tell you a story about an initiative working on reparations for Iraq during the context of an ongoing war of aggression, and what that means in the sense of how do you repair harm while it's still happening, which some of you were already pointing to. So if we go back about 9 years, if you all remember when the first big WikiLeaks drop happened, there was a video that got a lot of attention that came to be called the Collateral murder video, which was one example of the pretty awful incidents that were happening all the time in US-occupied Iraq. It was an attack from an Apache helicopter where 12 people were murdered and children were injured. And when that video came out and there was actually some attention on what was happening, some of the veterans from the company that had participated in it came together with some of us who were civilians active in this kind of work and released an open letter that, unless you read Arabic language media, you probably never saw because it did not really get out in English language media in this country. It was called the Open Letter of Reconciliation and Responsibility to the Iraqi People. And it was really about, from these veterans, an acknowledgement, an apology, and a commitment to try to make amends within knowing that there's no way to make that right. You know, saying, we humbly ask you what we can do to begin to repair the damage we caused. And the way that this open letter then was put into action to turn that intention into some action, it developed into what became a material aid project because that was what we were hearing from people on the ground that they wanted in immediately. And we, in order to do that, had to build connections with the families who had survived this attack, and also reach out and build some connections with some non-governmental organizations that could help make this possible. And we wound up partnering with an organization called Iraqi Health Now that was sending shipments of the kinds of things people were asking for on the ground, like generators, water filters, medical supplies. And we got a lot of really important guidance and both cultural and linguistic translation from a really amazing Iraqi-Palestinian activist named Raha, who some of you may know of his work as well. And in retrospect, it really largely failed. This initiative got some money and some supplies into people's hands, and that mattered. But we really, in terms of our bigger goals around what it meant to advance justice and to create some healing, not just around this specific tragedy and atrocity, but in the bigger systemic picture of the war, we didn't move the needle on that at all. And beyond that, we did some harm in the process. And I want to say a couple things about why I still think it was an important experiment before I say more about why there was damage done by it as well. It was really an attempt to take accountability for a war that we didn't want and didn't have control over, but needed to take responsibility for. And within that, we were trying to create a mechanism where US taxpayers who weren't veterans could actually participate in taking that responsibility and try to counter the compartmentalization that we have in this country, where we have this quote unquote volunteer military, which is really a poverty draft that's funneling poor and working class kids, who are mostly people of color and indigenous folks, to be cannon fodder. And then we say that they're the ones with the dirty hands, and the rest of us just declaim our complicity in that war. So, as we know, in a country that can carry on that kind of thing, we're a country that can carry on committing genocide, child separation, all the things that we are continuing to do both here and abroad. And for this reason, it was also really important for us to take an approach that was grassroots and not governmental, that the US government is not designed to, and it does not desire to participate in real reparations, justice, or healing. And that doesn't mean that we can let it off the hook for that amount of mass violence that's continuing to happen or for the wealth that's stolen. But it also meant that it was really important to us to be taking matters into our own hands and building more connections at the level of civil society. So if we look at reparations, and we could say this about justice too, as not just repairing harm, not just stopping it from continuing to happen, it brought us to these questions of who really gets to say what justice looks like, right? That's that values-centered part that someone brought up already. For Iraqis, who gets to say what it looks like after all that we've done, after all we've taken, after that amount of death? Who gets to define justice? And ultimately, I think that really wound up being where we failed in this initiative, because we know that Iraqis have to be the ones to tell us how justice is going to look, but it also has to be more than a few people, right? It needs to be able to come from organizations that are really rooted, that have legitimacy in the community, and that are playing a real democratic role. And us coming into this initiative and building it, we never were able to develop a real strategy for reparations because we weren't able to build a well-developed framework for justice, because we weren't able to get those vital questions answered by Iraqis beyond the small group of families we were working with. And then to say that the infrastructure and capacity on both sides of this bridge we were trying to build was lacking. And I don't call it a bridge to imply some kind of false symmetry in the experiences and the power happening on both sides, but to say that there had to be certain conditions on both sides to make it hold. And we were building a lot off a reparations model that has been much more successful, that's a partnership between Vietnam-era US veterans with Vietnamese organizations that has been really seeking to address specifically the damage done by Agent Orange. And the relationships that they have that have been the foundation for that project were not there for us with Iraqis at that time, and we weren't able to build them in the way that we had hoped to. And the reality from that is that we did some harm in the process of trying to remedy harm, which happens all the time, right? But is so fundamentally what we are seeking to do the opposite of, that I think it's important to name it and claim it. At worst, we fed into tensions between some of the families because we were not coming in equipped to really navigate what they were dealing with. And we weren't able to establish the relationships to make that work and to take into consideration the amount of trauma that was happening on both sides of this bridge. So to tell you this story, I tell this as something that I feel clear was in its majority of failure, and that has useful lessons in it, which feel very difficult to boil down to a tiny seed that fits into this conversation, and I'd love to talk more with folks if you're interested after this in other moments. But also to say that we still have to be really bold in our experiments, and that we have to be very, very careful about what's the difference between our impacts and our intentions when we're pursuing justice. That the important piece is our activities and what we do with our hands, and hands are a metaphor, it's not the only way that we make impact, but what we do that has effects on people, especially people who are going to be experiencing the blowback that we don't, matters a lot more than what's in our hearts if we're just keeping that silent and it's not in motion. So I wanted to ask you all to just take a minute to answer some questions just for yourself in your head that I'll ask. And I'm going on an assumption that of you all in this room that most or some or maybe all of you oppose the US's ongoing wars and occupations. So if that's true for you, what do you do with your hands about these unjust wars? And just thinking for yourself on it. If nothing, why? Or if not enough, why not? Is it feelings of futility or powerlessness? Is it not knowing what to do? Is it feeling like there's so much injustice in your own backyard that putting this energy into occupations on the other side of the world with people who you may never meet is what? Does it feel inappropriate? Does it feel less real? Does it feel less important? And can we do both? Can we be working on reparations for genocide and slavery on this occupied continent at the same time? And is it even actually possible that we can have justice at home without justice abroad, or vice versa? And what are we going to do with our hands about that? And my time's up. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So many rich questions that are going to be floating in this room, and we're going to do our presentations first, and then we're going to have a generative Q&A. So we're going to turn to Rachel.
Hi, good morning.
Good morning.
I want to thank everybody who is putting this big event on together, everybody at the Haas Institute and everybody whose labor goes into doing it, including the unionized hotel workers in this Marriott hotel, who really inspired all of us so much last year with their picket and their big win. I also want to thank Seth for helping us acknowledge the land that we're on and doing that in a way that wasn't just pro forma, but really made us think about what our commitments are. I want to thank everybody who shared their ideas about justice, and I want to thank Evan and Victoria for inviting me to speak today. This has been a very challenging, in a good way, challenging preparation for me to think about what to say about justice. And, you know, I've worked for a bunch of years, as Victoria mentioned, against a system calling itself the criminal justice system. And I've worked within movements calling themselves movements for social justice. And I'm still really, really struggling to understand what justice is. When I was really pressed, I was like, I have no idea what that is. And that was embarrassing. So I looked it up. And a lot of the definitions that I saw, or descriptions I saw, reflected things that you all said in the opening, right? Ideas about being fair or impartial, or treating each other the way that you'd like to be treated. And also conforming to societal standards of what's moral or upright or good or lawful, right? And I immediately had a reaction similar to the one from the back of the room, where I found myself asking, well, who gets to decide what's fair or what's upright? And I know, for instance, that in the United States, the criminal code designates what's lawful. But I also know that the criminal code is written by human beings, and that dozens of things get added to the criminal code each year. And I also know that none of the criminal code is based on some universal natural code, but rather on ideas about who needs to be contained or controlled. I've also, in my work against imprisonment and policing, encountered lots of justice for campaigns, right? So, and often those are related to somebody being killed or terribly hurt by cops or other state agents. And they usually center around the person who perpetrated that harm being locked up. So the phrase jail killer cops might be familiar to some of you, for instance. And the legal system adjudicates what constitutes that justice. And in that system, justice is almost always equivalent to punishment or to vengeance. So we're often left with the idea that justice is done if the right people were punished in the right way for the right amount of time, right? Social justice, which I also looked up, I saw described as fair relations between individuals and society. And so somebody was describing something similar to that in the opening as well. Fair relations in distribution of wealth, fair relations regardless of race or gender or ability or age, fair relations in access to quality housing, education, work, healthcare, and the ability to move freely or to be in relationship to the natural world. And in these cases, I found myself asking, why are we describing social justice struggles or social justice fights so often? Why do we have to fight for social justice? And I think, you know, I kept running into this problem. I've worked in also work that calls itself restorative justice or transformative justice or reparative justice to try to figure out how to address harm that happens between people or on behalf of the state to individuals. And so I was like, what's my problem? Why can't I get it together? Why can't I understand this? And I ultimately came to this, that I think the problem for me is that it seems like so little, right? Justice, fairness, equity, restoration to a previous state seems like the bare minimum that we should be asking for. And so I think my problem is I think we should be fighting for transformation of our conditions, not a restoration to previous state. We should be shifting and building power. We should be demanding liberation and self-determination. And I'm wondering if struggling for justice as our end goal limits our horizons in some way. So I'm also going to share a story of reparations. And I told Victoria and Evan, there's no way I can come up with a story, and then I came up with a story. So
You always surprise me.
caught in a lie again. So the story that I'm going to share comes from Chicago, and it's been really, really inspiring to me in the past few years. Are people in this room familiar with the Burge torture case? Yes? No? Ish? Okay. Well, we'll go over the basics again just in case. So there's been a fight in Chicago in the past, I don't know, 10 years, that has shifted around reparations frame for survivors of the Burge torture ring in that city. Between 1972 and 1991, a commander of the Chicago Police Department, John Burge, led a group of cops who engaged in systematic programs of torture, physical and psychological abuse against more than 100 people they had detained in order to extract confessions from them. And I'm going to mention some of those instances, so please brace yourselves if that's going to be difficult for you. The torture was terrible. Electric shocks to genitals, using cattle prods, suffocation, mock executions, beatings, verbal abuse, everything you can imagine. And a number of people confessed to things they hadn't done under that pressure, and some of those people were sentenced to death as a result of those forced confessions and found themselves in Illinois' death rows. And for many years, organizers and activists in Chicago fought for justice for survivors of Burge's tortures. So like beginning in the 70s, people were saying this thing is happening. They tried to bring light to the acts themselves. They tried to talk about the systematic nature of the abuse and to the racist targeting of black people in particular. They took their fight all the way to the United Nations. And after years of organizing and activism, John Burge was ultimately found guilty of perjury and obstruction of justice for falsely denying he and those working under him had engaged in torture. In 2011, Burge was sentenced to 4.5 years in prison. So justice was served, right? Burge got punished. But for the survivors, their loved ones, and the communities that they're part of, this brand of justice didn't really ring true. And this happens a lot in these kind of justice for moments, right? That even when so-called justice is served, the terms of the justice don't suit. People aren't satisfied with them, right? But in terms of this particular instance, it was a little bit different. And around the criminal legal remedies they had available to them, the survivors, the statute of limitations had run out on most of their civil remedies or civil options, and many of the survivors were still fighting their own criminal convictions or were still locked up for the criminal convictions related to their forced confessions. Most survivors were also still dealing with the effects of trauma of their torture as well, and Burge sitting in a cage did not address any of those needs. So a new wave of work began to move beyond justice to demand reparations for the Burge torture survivors. And the story of this campaign is too much to detail in the time I have, but through lots of very hard work, participation by Burge survivors in and out of prison, their families, and through creativity and good timing, the people advocating for reparations ultimately secured a package of reparations from the city that included monetary compensation, counseling services for police torture survivors and family members at a dedicated facility, free tuition at Chicago City colleges for torture survivors and their family members, including their grandchildren, job placement for torture survivors in programs for formerly imprisoned people, priority access to the City of Chicago's reentry support services, which included everything from job training and placement, counseling, food, transportation assistance, senior care, and health care, a formal apology from the mayor and city council for the torture committed by Burge and those under his command, a permanent public memorial acknowledging that the torture had been committed, and a history curriculum requirement on the Burge torture cases to be taught in all Chicago public schools in the 8th and 10th grades. So the reparations plan is now being implemented in Chicago, and there are all kinds of complications and challenges and some hard feelings, as you can imagine, about how it's rolling out. And the reparations package is an important victory for the survivors of policing, of the violence of policing, but I think it's also a really excellent example of the ways that traditional ideas of justice need to be stretched or tossed out even in hopes of real transformation or repair. And as Clare was mentioning, this was a bold experiment. This was a lot to ask for, a lot to demand, and they won almost everything they asked for. And reparations is getting a lot more attention these days, especially as Democratic presidential candidates are being asked to take positions on it. And while financial compensation is often the thing that people focus on primarily, serious approaches to reparations offer a more comprehensive frame that includes, in various language, cessation and guarantees of non-repetition, restitution, compensation, satisfaction, rehabilitation. And as Clare was mentioning, kind of a holistic approach to kind of what needs to be repaired, not just set back to a previous state. And I'm gonna go through this quickly because I'm near the end of my time, but I wanna describe what these things are. Cessation and guarantees of non-repetition mean that systematic and systemic injury must stop and must not be repeated. Restitution aims to restore the victims of injury to at least the situation they were in before the injury, a restoration of freedom, recognition of their humanity, their identity, their culture, etc. Compensation gets used if the damage is not made good by restitution. They might seek additional compensation for harm done. Satisfaction is aimed at addressing emotional or psychological injury, and rehabilitation involves mind, body, emotional, and spiritual healing from the lasting effects of trauma incurred as a result of the injury. And reparation is not completed unless all of these things are considered. It's not merely a payout, right? Reparation means full repair is the way that in COBRA, the National Coalition on Black Reparations in America calls it. While reparations frame isn't appropriate for every situation, I raise it here today as a counter to an understanding of justice that's common in the US, which is very rooted in Judeo-Christian thinking, eye for an eye, or transactional if we think about it. It's as if it's possible to achieve justice in some one-to-one trade-off. Someone steals something from you, they go to prison. Someone hurts your child, they go to prison. Someone tortures 100 people over the course of decades, they go to prison. The failure to consider, much less address the full implications of harm and what might be repaired or transformed from that situation of harm leaves us in a really limited situation. Justice as a minimum demand to bring attention to harm or coercion or inequity seems a good start, but I don't think it's enough. I think we have to fight for liberation, for self-determination, and for a transformation of our conditions. I think we deserve, at the very least, that. Thanks.
It was a hard story to share, but I'm so glad you did.
That's a good one. Yeah.
Thank you, Rachel. And we're going to turn to Raha Jorjani.
Good morning, afternoon, somewhere in the middle. There's a legal system in America today in which a person can be arrested and imprisoned without the right to an attorney unless they're wealthy enough to afford one. I say wealthy enough because it's not enough actually to be financially okay. You have to have a lot of income, you have to have savings, you have to have a financial backdrop. So I just want to be clear, right? To afford an attorney, you have to be wealthy enough to afford one. And in that same legal system, in which the fate of an imprisoned person is determined, there is no protection against cruel and unusual punishment. There is little protection against prolonged incarceration. There are no speedy trial rights. There is no statute of limitations that governs at what point the government must act, right? That they have to act within a certain period of time if they're going to punish you for something. In that same legal system, the prosecutors and the judges have the same boss. I'm going to say that one more time. In this legal system that I'm referring to in America, the people who put you in the jail And the people who determine whether or not you stay there work for the same person, and that's the U.S. Attorney General. The U.S. Attorney General today, and for many days before that, right, is somebody who I think we can safely acknowledge as a white nationalist and a white supremacist. In that legal system, you have to appear at the hearing that will decide your fate by video from a detention center hours away. In that legal system, you're statistically likely to have to appear without an attorney to navigate what are known as the most complex laws in the nation. That's not my opinion. I can vouch for that as someone who practices this type of law, but that is actually an undisputed fact. You will be expected to do so not only without a lawyer, but without access to an interpreter who can translate the charging documents, motions, briefs, and pleadings that will be submitted by the government while it is trying to keep you in custody and against your interests. So if you cannot read, or you cannot read or write English fluently, the hearing will be held essentially without your knowledge of the facts being shared about you and against you. In that legal system, the jailers believe, and they'll admit this in open court, and I'm happy to provide the transcripts, that they have more power to determine who will be jailed than a judge does. In fact, in that legal system, the prosecutors can override a judge's decision to release someone on bond. In that legal system, even if you stay detained for the 4 to 12 months that it takes in civil custody, and you're lucky enough to win, the government can extend your detention by 6 to 12 months simply by choosing to appeal the decision to a more conservative appellate court. You remain in the cage even after you win. If that system sounds dangerous to you, it's because it is. If that system sounds impossible and absurd to you, then look no further than U.S. immigration courts. And U.S. immigration courts fall under what we call the Department of Justice. Right. So that is what American justice actually looks like today. I wish I was in a more positive place. But I think that's I also found it really, I found it challenging to figure out what would be impactful to share with you here today, because I don't know that we have ever possessed or experienced meaningful justice, right? And it's certainly, and I am guilty of this as well, it's certainly easier to talk about what injustice looks like, right, than to talk about what meaningful justice should look like. I represent folks, or I advocate on behalf of folks who are twice thrown out by our society. Essentially, once by the criminal legal system, the criminal and justice system, and then a second time by the immigration system. So they are folks who are marginalized and victimized first because they have been accused of committing a crime. Whether or not they have committed one, totally different story, and frankly, doesn't matter to anything that I'm talking about. Guilt or innocence is not at all the point here. But so they've been once targeted by that system, and then a second time by an immigration system that then tells them after they have served their time, whatever our thoughts are on the criminal legal system in today's society, they have served their time. They have, in quotes, right, this is to use the language of those who define justice, paid their dues, paid the fines, paid the restitution, done the time, been on probation, been surveilled, had their lives monitored, been in shackles, come to visitation in shackles to visit family members, appeared on video, had no due process. After all of that is done, you're subject to a second layer of injustice, and that is that now you will face deportation. And we'll do that to you, we, the United States, will do that to you in a system that we call civil. And when we call it civil, the thing about that is that so many of even the most minimal rights that attach when we otherwise are acting against you as the government, those rights don't attach because we're calling it civil. And so we don't have to provide you with the same level of rights. The cruel and unusual, right, the protections supposedly against cruel and unusual punishment, for example, don't apply to my immigrant clients who are detained by the Department of Homeland Security for prolonged periods under civil immigration laws. They don't apply because what they're experiencing, despite the shackles and despite the cages and despite the time that they're spending in prison and the forced separation from their families and the potential banishment and exile to countries where they may face death or worse, none of that is actually legally considered punishment. And if it's not legally considered punishment, then even the minimums that we provide to those that are supposedly being punished are inapplicable. I want to make a couple more points. I was at a gathering the other day for Iranian New Year, and I was with folks in my community who I consider to be progressive folks, who carry many of the values that I do. And I was telling, I had met a new person at this gathering, and I was telling her what I do for a living. And I immediately got, thank you for doing what you do. I really appreciate that you are representing immigrants, in this, especially in this time. And then we talked more about the fact that I represent folks who have been impacted by the criminal justice system. And then came the question that I've gotten for my entire career of about 14, 15 years, and that is, but we're not talking about rapists, right? We're not talking about rapists, right? We absolutely are. We're talking about folks who have been convicted of rape. We're talking about folks who have been convicted of murder. We're talking about folks who have been convicted of sex abuse of a minor. We're talking about folks that have been convicted of theft. We're talking about folks who have been convicted of sex abuse of a minor after being harmed in terrible ways themselves as victims, who are then told later, years later, when they commit the same offenses, that they are no longer victims, that they cannot any longer think of themselves as victimized people because now they have perpetrated these offenses against other people. I want to be clear about who I'm talking about. All of the advocacy, all of the plea for human rights is on behalf of all of those folks, right? Because I can tell you the story that I'm sure all of you can repeat back to me, because many have, about, I heard that somebody can be driving without a license and then they're deported. It's just, that's so messed up. And, the guy who just takes a stick of gum and he's deported, and gosh, that's just so unfair. And I want to submit to you that even the folks who have far, far more serious convictions deserve the same rights and the same advocacy, and it doesn't make it any less right or any more fair. And I think, did you hold up the 1 minute? Okay, gosh. Just the final thought, I think for me, my immediate response to that response is, but why don't you care about the other kinds of crimes, though? Are you as up in arms about the stuff that Clare talked about the wars? Because there are multiple legal acts, endless legal acts that are being committed by this government every single day, by people in this country every single day, by bankers, by folks who commit environmental injustice every single day, that maim and kill and hurt, and we never seem to be up in arms about those crimes, not as much as we are, right, about the one individual who committed an offense against another individual. And I guess my hope is that we collectively expand our definition of justice to go beyond this idea of individual justice that I think a lot of us get wrapped up in, and to instead look for structural and systemic, right, justice that ultimately lands us in healthy communities, right? Healthy communities is what our government should want for us. Healthy communities, whole communities, is never. There's no evidence that this government has ever wanted that for us. I'll leave it there.
All right, we expected a lot of work in the room and emotion, and that's exactly where we are. So I'm going to turn to Seth for our last piece of conversation before we open up.
So again, I just want to say thanks to my fellow panelists, to the organizers of this panel, and of the conference more generally, and most especially in this moment, thanks to all of you for the time that we're sharing together here. I tend to think about justice in the context of particular relationships. And I want to ask you to think with me for a moment about 3 relationships. The first relationship is one between a lawyer and a client. The second relationship is one between the justice system, and I'll embody that in courts, and what the Supreme Court has called discrete and insular minorities, and I'll talk about that in a moment. The third relationship I would ask us to think about is the relationship between a settler colonial government and Indigenous peoples. And what I want to invite us to ask about these 3 relationships is whether there's a thread we can trace through all 3. And whether in tracing that thread, we can learn something about law and justice, and when they may run out, whether we need to change our conceptions of them, and whether and in what context particular conceptions of law and justice can be a barrier to what Rachel called transformation, empowerment, self-determination. So let me talk about the first relationship, that between a lawyer and a client. I am a lawyer, so I speak from some experience here. Under American law, lawyers are known as, they have a legal status. They're called fiduciaries. What is a fiduciary? Well, a fiduciary is a person who has a particular position in a legally recognized relationship. So what are the grounds for recognition of such a relationship under our law? And by our here, I mean American lawyers. You have to have a relationship of power and vulnerability. That's the way we construct the relationship. The idea is that a fiduciary is trusted with power over another's interests, and that other is especially vulnerable to that power, to that fiduciary, to that lawyer. The relationship here, of course, I'm thinking of is between a lawyer and a client. This invites a lawyer to think of themselves as a guardian, as someone who makes decisions, exercising the power they have, of course, loyally and faithfully for the benefit of the person that's vulnerable to them. So that's a fiduciary. Rests in a notion of guardianship by one who has power on behalf of one who doesn't. This kind of notion is embedded in how American constitutional law talks about what it calls discrete and insular minorities. That phrase comes from a famous footnote. Every American lawyer knows it. Footnote 4 from Caroline Products. Caroline Products is actually a case about milk and the regulation of when you can say, yeah, I've substituted some stuff into this drink, but it's still milk. No one ever remembers that. It's a case actually about milk. But in a footnote, the court opines about the standard of review of legislation under constitutional law. And it says typically what courts will do is defer to anything that looks rational. As long as it looks rational, we'll defer to it. But we won't defer to it when the legislation burdens discrete and insular minorities, right? There's complex definitions of that, right? One example we could think about, right, would be racial minorities. And I'm going to pick up that in just a moment. Now, the idea the court invokes here is that somehow courts are guardians. They are special guardians of the rights of discrete and insular minorities. And that leads to a kind of constitutional law that's focused on courts exercising their power on behalf of the vulnerable. I'm not saying this is what is happening in American constitutional law right now. What I'm trying to do is trace the thread of the idea. Okay? Courts exercising their power as guardians on behalf of those who don't have power, right? So in the area of, an area I've written about comes constitutional law and its applications to police violence and policing, for example, right? The idea is the courts will identify individual rights, it will protect those rights when they're infringed, et cetera, right? What about alternatives? What about community control of policing, for example? What about abolition? What about transformation? What about empowerment? That's not baked into this core conception of equal protection that I'm talking about from footnote 4. Hear that phrase, equal protection. Protection can mean a lot of things. One of the things it means under footnote 4 is an empowered body protecting a disempowered one. Okay? The third relationship between settler colonial governments and indigenous peoples. I used the word guardian advisedly. Why? If you look at opinions of the United States Supreme Court, opinions that have not been overruled, opinions that are still the law today, opinions that, for example, right, say that the reason that title to the lands that we're on right now is not held by Ohlone peoples is because, well, when Christians got here, they found non-Christians. And while under the doctrines of international law, of course, Christians would recognize the property rights, the ultimate title of other Christians, even in contexts of conquest. They would not do so if they found non-Christians, indigenous peoples on the land. All title in the U.S. today, the validity of all title to land in the U.S. stretches back to that holding, which is still the law of the land. Out of that holding comes the notion that the land was taken, but it creates a special relationship between the settler colonial government and indigenous peoples' governments. And when that special relationship is first characterized in our law, it's characterized as a fiduciary one between a guardian and a ward. Why did indigenous peoples need guardians? Because they were savage. I'm quoting the opinion. Okay? But of course, the guardian recognizes the especial vulnerability of the ward. The U.S. recognizes the especial vulnerability of indigenous peoples. And therefore, in that context of the government-to-government relationship, it exercises its power loyally and faithfully as a guardian, right? Again, not saying this is what has been done. I'm saying this is the concept embedded in the law. And so we come full circle. All three relationships involve an idea about law and justice that's focused on guardians. One person with power acting to protect another who lacks it. There are other models. There are other models that would allow us to think about law, justice, self-determination and empowerment, transformation in different ways. Let me give you one. And I just mean this to be a collective question. How many of us in the room have read a treaty between the United States and an American Indian nation? Right? Let's read those. As Anishinaabe scholar John Boris would tell us, those treaties don't create rights just for indigenous peoples. They create rights for all non-indigenous peoples too. Many of those treaties, not all, many, start with the idea of a treaty partnership. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy, for example, characterizes this through the two-row wampum. Two peoples, both in canoes, paddling down the same river, right? Alongside one another, right? But both empowered, both paddling. The question I want to leave us with is, in our own practice, in our own scholarship, in our own lives, when have we been guardians? And when have we been fellow paddlers? Thank you.
All right, I don't know about you, but hearing a lawyer talk about abolition, I'm excited. So I'll come around the room and give you the mic. Who'd like to start with a question?
Hi, I'm Emil. I'm over here talking with Robert, and what I'm talking to him about is a deep frustration coming up for me as I listen to you all talk. I hear you all talking about a system. I hear you all talking about problems in the system, and what underlies these problems seems to be obvious to me, and that's like the law and the Constitution is a law and constitution for white men. And so we talk about, well, like, how do we fix it? But it's like, it's not broken, right? It's like criminal justice, civil justice, immigration detention. None of these laws or systems are broken. They're operating exactly as they were intended to operate. So given that that's the case, what do we do about that? Like, we do a lot of talking about what it is, but what is the actual concrete step to start creating a system, a legal system, a social system, an educational system, a system of organization, a system of philanthropy that's for us? And by us, I mean people who aren't white men. That's my question.
Thank you. So I'm going to gather a couple of more questions, and then we'll go back to the panel for some reflection. Next question from somebody. Right at the front, making me work for it.
Thank you. I appreciate the breadth of information that was shared, and I work in the immigration and justice system as a legal advocate, and have really been looking deeply at how, as legal advocates, we replicate the settler approach in serving clients, and that is very much modeled on white savior mentality, because most of the folks, immigrants, are brown, and so it's perfect. And so what happens is, this is toxic for me as a woman of color, as a queer woman of color, and I know it's toxic for other folks of color who participate as legal advocates. And part of that is that it's seen as an external service and not really recognizing how we relate. So we talk about relationships. It's like how those who are committed to transformative justice, liberative justice, self-determination justice, how to relate to each other that's not replicating the harms that in the systems that we work in. And so I think that is as important as we're working towards a dream that is inclusive.
Thank you. I'm going to take one over here. Yep, got the gym working.
So as a means of giving back to what I see as an aggressive profession in this country, I volunteer time to our federal court locally to serve as a mediator in litigation matters. And the trend that I've seen is that lawyers and their clients don't want to be in the room together, that people resist the conversation. And building bridges, I've heard it over the course of the last few days, is really about how do we stay in that tough conversation? How do we stay in the conversation about these questions? How do we entertain the difficult, uncomfortable positions we find ourselves in order to be able to figure out where each other are coming from so that we can come up with solutions that might work for everybody that no one's going to think of when we're not building that bridge. And that the legal system, as I see it, and it's just my opinion, but there's less and less conversation the further we go forward with technology and the more lawyers are no longer picking up the telephone and talking to each other.
Thank you. So one or all of those questions our panelists would like to respond to? Seth wants to go.
Some of the most, I think this responds at least to the first two questions, although it may seem obliquely. I hope it won't. Some of the most interesting conversations I've had about those questions as they apply to the relationship between settler colonial governments and indigenous peoples have not been about law. They've been about the textbooks used in Texas to teach children. When I gave a talk at the University of Arizona at the Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy Program. The talk was called American Colonialism and Constitutional Redemption, right? You know, having separated church and state, some group of Americans made a church out of their state and a sacred scripture out of their constitution. And I opened that talk by recounting something that I imagine my daughter is likely to hear or read in a textbook in a few years when she's in elementary school. And so I actually think a lot of the concrete work cannot be done by lawyers, by departments of justice, by whatever. I think that a lot of the concrete work has to start early, and it has, at least in the space that I'm talking about here, and it has to combine not just education, so not just the land acknowledgement statement, but also the call to action that comes at the end of it. So that's at least one thought.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, there's three great questions.
Yeah, I want to respond to the first question or comment. That was a real easy one. Thank you. That was super, super easy. But no, I really appreciated that, and I don't know if you could hear. Let me look at you. I don't know if you could hear, but essentially everyone here while you were talking was nodding and essentially agreeing with exactly what you're saying. The system is absolutely working exactly as it was intended to work. And so in that way, it is not at all broken. And I think I don't really have an answer for you, and so that's even more frustrating. I think just to be really honest with you, as a lawyer working in that system, I struggle with that every single day. All of the contradictions. One of the contradictions being that I am helping folks fight for the right to stay here where Black and brown bodies are treated like they do not matter at all, right? And so all of that to then stay here and be subject to potentially more violence, more poverty, more disrespect, more separation, and so on and so forth. I think what I tell myself, for better or for worse, what I tell myself is that if I have a skill that I can use to get someone outside of a human cage, I'm going to put that skill to use. And for as long as someone wants me to help them in that way and they're helping me in that way, then that's something that I'm going to do. But I'm going to try to be a truth teller the whole time, right? And I think that is, in many ways, the only other thing that I feel that I can do is to constantly strive to be telling the truth, to tell the truth with my clients, to my clients, for them to tell the truth to me, for me to tell the truth to the judge and to the Department of Homeland Security, so that we can call this thing, this whatever the heck it is we're doing, so that we can call it what it is. Yeah, I don't know if others want to.
Thank you, Raha. Rachel or Claire?
I don't have anything to add, I don't think, beyond what Seth and Raha.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah, on that easy first one. I am also agreeing. Yes, thank you for stating what is the question, right? Mm-hmm. It's how are we going to make that kind of transformation possible? And I was just thinking that when those of us on the panel were talking about it beforehand, I was saying, as an abolitionist, I feel like the actual horizons of what we're going for are so far away. They're such long horizons. But then thinking about it more, I'm like, well, that also, it has to be in the seeds of everything we're doing every day. Like, I can't just think about it as a long horizon. I can't let myself have that luxury. And I think what you're saying of, well, the system is designed to do exactly what it's doing, that we just have to be figuring out how we balance both the fighting like hell for daily improvements with not letting that compromise that longer vision, that actually what we need is transformation. And knowing that there are groups of people in tons of different kinds of work all around this country, and even more so around the world, that are strategizing around that, and to figure out how each of what we are doing can link into that bigger transformation, like what each one of us has to contribute to that larger project.
Thank you. And so we know that we enter these spaces and we share them because we've got so much work to do. And also we want to walk out of them with things to do. And so unfairly, perhaps, we asked our panelists to share with you something that they think of as actionable that they would like to offer. And so with that, I'd like to invite the panel to do that.
Do I have to go first? I think, by way of response to the comments and the question, and to think about something to encourage people to do, is also to denaturalize these systems. There is nothing natural about the criminal legal system. We don't merely have to accept its existence as a given. There's nothing natural about there being security guards in stores. There's nothing natural about police being on your corner or there being surveillance cameras everywhere you go. And I think the kind of denaturalization of that and the kind of being conscious of the fact of those things is actually really important. And then furthermore, I think to do what you can in all ways to support the organizing muscle and the self-determination of imprisoned people. And that means recognizing imprisoned people as human beings who need connections. And Raha, thank you so much for kind of busting apart this kind of guilt and innocence, who gets to be innocent, because all people living in cages are human beings who need a measure of their humanity to be acknowledged all day. And a lot of really, really good organizers are living inside of cages right now, and we need to support their efforts to win their own liberation in partnership with people working to do that on the outside. And so I think those are concrete actions that people can take.
I asked folks who came back from last month's Iraqi Civil Society Solidarity Initiative conference that just happened in Iraq, what they would recommend to you all at this conference if there was a way that you wanted to be taking solidarity actions, supporting organizing that's happening now in Iraq. And they want you to check out this organization that is called SaveTheTigris.org. Tigris is Tigris, one of the mighty rivers of that region. And like water defenders here, people there are doing work around self-determination and decolonization with water at the center of it. And also for those of you who live here on Ohlone land, and in particular for those of you like me who are, I want to speak to my fellow descendants of settlers, for us in particular, to really consider, if you don't already pay the Shumi land tax, to check out that project as well. It's SHUUMI, Shumi Land Tax, run by Indigenous women here.
So I talked a lot about sort of what happens at the intersection, right, between the criminal legal system and the immigration legal system. And I've been spending a lot of time in the last couple of years focusing on the role of prosecutors, both immigration prosecutors and criminal prosecutors. And I would submit to you that we have spent a lot of time generally over the last sort of decade focusing on sort of the role of judges, right, the implicit bias and the violence that happens at the hands of the decisions that judges make. We've certainly spent a good amount of time focusing on police violence, police killing, police brutality, mass incarceration, surveillance by probation departments, so on and so forth. But we haven't spent enough time talking about prosecutors who arguably hold the greatest power in our systems. And so I would invite you to really focus on what is happening in your community in your name. Because when the prosecutors are in the courtrooms, they're referred to as the people. They're referred to as the people of the state of California, the people of the state of Texas, the people of the state of Louisiana, the people of the United States, right? That is how the court refers to them. Are the people ready? Yes, the people are ready, Your Honor. That's you. So everything that is happening literally a few blocks down that way and a few blocks down that way at Wiley Manual Courthouse and Renee C. Davidson, shout out to all the public defenders that are fighting right now on behalf of our communities against those systems. Everything that is happening there is happening in your name, and you have a right to know who, please get involved in elections of prosecutors and sheriffs, right? And public defenders. These folks work for you and they have to be accountable to you. Ask for meetings with your local prosecutor. Ask for meetings with the County of Alameda's prosecutor, the County of Contra Costa's prosecutor, and ask what they are doing, right, in your name every day.
Thank you, Raha. Finally, Seth.
I'm a teacher, and so my answer will come out of that, but I'm also very much a learner. And one of the things that I've learned from my time working with my students is how to be a much better listener and how bad, particularly those of us who are lawyers, are at listening. We're not trained to do it, quite frankly. That's not the way the law school classroom works. So an exercise I like to do, at least every other class when I teach, is to have my students pair off. They've been given a question of some sort, and very deliberately work through sharing ideas with one another and listening, and to think very deliberately and intentionally about both. How does one listen? How does one sit? How do you show that you're listening? How do you show recognition, and so on? And I find the more expert one gets, the harder that work can become. And so I guess my call to action is to find spaces every day to practice listening. Now, why do I mention this given where I started? Because in my experience, one of the biggest barriers to work between non-Indigenous people and Indigenous people involves failures to listen.
Great, thank you. Thank you for being here and all the work that you do coming in and out of this room. And please join me in thanking our panelists today.